Janan Ganesh, 2016, what a year. Brexit and the Trump victory. Do you see any similarities? Have we suddenly seen a great upsurge in populism in Britain?
Well, one of the similarities is that my profession failed to see either event coming, so it's been a chastening year. Looking back, we should not have been as surprised as we were, because both events were driven by a section of the demographic that was similar in both countries. It was a particular anger amongst predominantly white working class to lower middle class voters, predominantly in deindustrialized areas of America and Britain, and in Britain in particular, the coastal areas as well. So the voting groups that caused the events are similar. They've been around for decades. People have tried to warn us about them for decades. And I think we underplayed exactly how many of them there were, how angry they were, and how likely they were to turn out.
Is this a reflection, Janan, and I speak guardedly to you as an Arsenal supporter, but is this because we're obsessed with London? We see everything through the London lens?
I think a large part of it is that. So we need to go sort of at least to mid-table in the Premier League and visit more Stoke Cities, maybe more Evertons.
Middlesbrough.
Northern towns, medium-sized towns, which were in their pomp maybe in the mid-20th century when this country still had a big industrial base, and really have been declining and getting poorer since then. If I lived there, I'd be absolutely seething. So I shouldn't be surprised that on the day, June 23rd of this year, they turned out to reject all consensus politics in this country.
Janan, how much was this a personal failure on the part of then Prime Minister David Cameron?
Hugely, I think. And it wasn't because the campaign itself was prosecuted particularly badly. I can't think what obvious thing they could have done that he chose not to.
They could have tried being positive.
They could have made a more positive case for the European Union, but you then look at the underlying survey evidence, and there's not a huge bank of positive feeling towards the EU amongst British voters. They were always in this project for essentially pragmatic economic reasons. We joined in the 70s when we were the sick man of Europe. Europe was massively outgrowing us. We did not join for the emotional reasons that France or Italy or Germany might have joined. What he could have done differently is the negotiation itself. And I've talked to people since June, when the referendum was lost, talked to people in the Remain campaign and in David Cameron's former number 10. And they all say, had we done this, had we asked for this, had we offered maybe...
Like a break on migration, he needed that.
He needed
because immigration was a huge part of this.
Yeah, I think it was the single biggest part of why the referendum was lost. And had he, for example, even offered a bigger budget contribution, which is this idea that's been kicking around now, that you go to the EU and say, we pay £9 billion net, what if we increase that in return for some kind of migration control, call it a 7-year transitional period, which we could have had in 2004, chose not to. Why don't we have it now? We'll pay for it. Something like that, I think, could have turned the referendum.
Well, that's a could, would, should
Yeah.
Angle. But I want to come back to something you said, which is the debate was on economic grounds. This was about, and we as British people were members of the European Union for economic reasons, yet arguably you could say that this was the most irrational economic decision, because in the short term at least it's going to hurt us.
Yeah.
Being out.
Well, in the short term, it's depressed the currency, which hasn't fed through into retail prices yet. But if we're having the same chat this time next year, I wouldn't be surprised if people are beginning to feel the pinch unless wages increase to match the price increase. On the economics, what really surprises me about both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump is how, at least on the surface, how economically successful these two countries are. This country voted for a radical departure from the European Union despite unemployment being, I think, 5.5%, something roughly similar in the US. Now, that's not a perfect measure, and there are people inactive in the labour market, and the prosperity is spread around in a very uneven way. But on the macro picture, this is not a country you would say is in such a big economic crisis as to vote for something quite as drastic as Brexit. So I wonder whether in the coming years we're going to have to dig beneath the macro figures and really pay more attention to the difference between living standards in somewhere like Stoke and somewhere like Islington, where the Arsenal are based.
Now, Theresa May gave this famous, some say infamous, conference speech in Birmingham where she denounced the citizens of the world If you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. How would you assess her first few months as Prime Minister?
She has done a very good job of immediately connecting with the kind of voter who voted to leave in the referendum. So she's talked a good socially conservative game, very critical of immigration. The line about citizens of the world being citizens of nowhere antagonised people like me, might have antagonised people like Mark Carney, a Canadian-born governor of the Bank of England. But the kind of voter who voted to leave would have said, well, this for the first time in a generation is a Prime Minister who understands that the liberal age maybe has been taken too far. So she's done a good job of that. That's not quite the same. Connecting with the public is not quite the same as doing a good job as Prime Minister. And I wonder whether over the next year, when she invokes Article 50, which begins the formal talks before the end of March, some of the weaknesses behind the scenes that I hear of.
She's too narrow. She spent all her time as Home Secretary.
Incredibly narrow, and the narrowest department of all. The one department which doesn't create anything but just prevents problems from blowing up. And she did a very good job as Home Secretary for 6 years in keeping a lid on all the unexploded bombs that take place in interior ministry politics. As Prime Minister, you're creating things, you're making decisions, you're making announcements, and there'll be no bigger announcement than what kind of deal she seeks from the European
Union. She's been very clear not to spell out any details, saying it's not binary, Brexit means Brexit. But do you think she's going to have to be clearer before March about what terms of deal for Britain?
Maybe not before March, but at the point of triggering Article 50, she will have to say what the top line negotiating position is. Even if she doesn't say it publicly, it'll be leaked by the European side anyway, so we'll find out.
What about the opposition? Jeremy Corbyn, he survived a leadership challenge. He is of the hard left. Do we have an opposition party in Britain today?
I was going to say, what opposition?
I mean, they didn't campaign for Remain.
They didn't campaign assiduously enough to move their own voters, who split much more towards Leave than people were expecting. But Theresa May should be in more trouble than she's in. She's got a very slim parliamentary majority. It fell recently when she lost a by-election in Richmond in southwest London, and there's no parliamentary pressure at all. So Labour are both sort of inept and ideologically away from where the public are, despite the fact they've got numerically, they're in the fight when it comes to parliamentary matters. I don't think she faces any trouble from them. She doesn't really face much trouble from the media because the pro-Brexit press want her to do well. In the absence of media pressure, in the absence of parliamentary pressure, I think she can afford to be a fairly unremarkable Prime Minister and still cruise through the next year.
So Britain after Brexit, we've been seen as an engaged, important military power, political weight in Europe. I mean, does this completely change the way we see Britain and our role in the world?
It need not. It's not absolutely incumbent that if you leave the European Union, you also shrink from all your other international responsibilities and burdens. And the test might be European policy towards Russia. Because if there is a feeling of insecurity towards the eastern edge of Europe, what is the one country that has the military capacity and the culture of doing things abroad that could make a decisive contribution? And that is Britain. There's only really France and Britain within the European Union that is militarily significant. And there's no reason at all why we necessarily would give that up just because we're leaving the formal structure of the EU. Everything hinges on how open or parochial Theresa May is, but I don't get the sense that she's so parochial that she will sign off on Britain's international role entirely. So maybe in 5 years' time we'll be surprised at how engaged, how active we are internationally.
So I'm going to put you on the spot now, Janan. How would you describe Britain post-Brexit as we enter this phase of preparing to leave the European Union? What are we? Are we sort of Elizabethan buccaneers? Are we introspective isolationists or what?
I think we are run by, and the referendum campaign was won by, a lot of buccaneering Elizabethan types who want to turn us into another trading hub as we were back then. But the people who voted for it, I think, are a bit more minded to be insular, who think globalisation has gone too far, who are suspicious of trade, suspicious of open borders. And the difference between the people who won the referendum campaign and the people who actually voted to leave might be the story of British politics, because one side is going to be disappointed.
And Scotland?
It'll still be in the in the UK, I think, in a few years' time, simply because the underlying polling, not that we put a huge amount of store by that anymore, hasn't shifted much since June 23rd.
A slightly unhappy, but still a united kingdom.
Just about.
Janan, good to talk.
Thank you.